Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use hooks in React.js to build a countdown timer. Okay, so what you can see on my screen right now is the starting state for our application, which if I click show countdown, has a static clock at the moment. All right, so it doesn't actually move, but it just has a fixed number of time on it, right? So 6 days, 22 hours, 38 minutes, and 54 seconds, okay? Now, at the moment, if I toggle this, you'll see that the timer does go down, but it just doesn't go down while the component is on screen, okay? So that's one of the things we're going to solve in this video. Now, this code is kept in the app.js, or at least the starting part of it is, and you can see that we're setting a default date here at the top before our app component. And all this does is just go, okay, take the current time when the application started and add 6 days, 22 hours, and 40 minutes. So obviously at the moment, that's not the case on screen, but keep in mind that this window has been running for probably a couple of minutes now. So if I close this and open it up again, it's going to continue to go down, right? So it's been 2 minutes since I first started this application. Now, where the code resides for this component that we're going to update is in the components folder under ticker and ticker.js, okay? So how this code looks at the moment is we grab the current time, so which is now. We then compare to see if the future date, which in the case of this is in the future, whether it's actually before now. And if that's the case, then it will say the time is up, right? So if I come over and say, let's add, -6 days into the past. Well, now it's going to say time is up because this is in the past, okay? So that's how that logic works. So that's what this function does. And then we instantiate a few variables here, days, hours, minutes, and seconds to make up this time. And then if we say the time isn't up, therefore the time is in the future, we're going to use this special function called interval to duration, which again comes from the date FNS library, right? So that's a special library that we're using to work out what the differences are between the two times, which is the current time and the future time. And based on that, we get an output of how many days, how many hours, how many minutes, and how many seconds, applied based on the duration in time. So if we're 3 days ahead, this will be 3 days. If we're 3 days and 4 hours ahead, well, this will be 4 hours, and then minutes and seconds accordingly, right? And then all we're doing down here is we've got a component that checks to see if the time is up. It will show that div that we just saw, or in the case of what we have right now, it just shows us in each cell the days, hours, minutes, and seconds in each box, right? So that's how this currently works. Now, the problem with this, obviously, is that it's not counting down, right? It's just flat numbers. So there are a couple of ways that we can solve this. Firstly, I'll show you 2 ways that you shouldn't do because it just simply won't work and it won't be performant. And then I'll show you the last way of doing it. So the first approach that someone might take without understanding React.js is to come in and say, well, that's easy. I can just go set interval. All right, so they'll come in here, they'll set interval, they'll create a function, they'll say run this every second, and then they'll go, okay, I'll set this to a let because I want to change the now, and then inside of here, I'll just go now is equal to new date, right? And then they'll save this, and then they'll realize very quickly that the date doesn't actually update in real time, right? They're like, but hang on, I'm updating this value every time. Shouldn't it update now and then run this function again? Well, that's not how React works, right? React works on the basis that you can only rerun this component if you edit any state. But the problem with this code even more so is if we decide to add a console log to this. So if I go console.log ticking, like so, and we let that come through, I'll refresh the screen and I'll click show countdown. What you're going to see is it's actually ticking down here, right? But nothing's actually happening. But what's worse is if I click hide countdown, well, that code is still ticking, right? And even worse than that is if we open it again, which will cause this component to re-render, it'll create a second instance of set interval. So now you'll see that this is actually ticking even more than before, right? And if I hide it again and show it again, you'll see it ticks even more so. And so on and so forth, right? It just gets worse and worse and worse. So obviously, this is not the way to do it. This is referred to as a side effect, and by default, React components are not meant to have side effects unless we show another mechanism, which I'll show in a minute. So that's the first way of doing it wrong, okay? The second way is you might understand how state works, right, in components. So now you'll say, okay, I'm going to set now to be in state. So you'll do something like this. You'll go const now set now equals use state, and then you'll put the default value to be the current time, and then you'll just import this. So you'll get it from React, and then you'll say, okay, I'm going to put this at the top, and then inside of set interval, you're now going to go, instead of assigning the value directly, you're just going to call set now and go new date to get a new date, right? And this will be interesting. Once we save this, what you're going to see now is the timer actually ticks down. So you're like, oh, it's working, right? Well, let's look down the console. What's going on here? Look at that. Look at the number of times it's ticking. Now, why is this happening, right? Why is there so many ticks? Well, let's think about it. If we call set now right now, it's going to cause a new render of this ticker component. And that new render of each ticker component is going to create a new instance of set interval, which will then call set now, which will create another run of the component, which will call set interval again, which will call that, and so on and so forth, right? To the point where if I try to refresh this now, I can't do so because I've tied up the browser. The browser's now in a lot of trouble. So I'm going to have to open up a new window, close the current one, and load it again, okay? Now, I'm not going to click on show countdown right now because I'll create the same issue, but this is another way you should not do it, okay? So basically, in React, you shouldn't use any kind of side effect inside of a component. That's the primary goal here. But obviously, we want to have a set interval because we want to update this component on an interval basis. So how do we do that? Well, the appropriate way is to use a webhook. Sorry, not a webhook, a React hook called useEffect, right? And this takes a callback function and it takes a second parameter. Now, I'll get to the second parameter in a minute, but basically all we need to do now is call the same code we just did, but there will be an issue with it still. So if I go set interval this time, and I should have kept that previous code, but I didn't. So now if I come here and I go once again, set now to new date, and we'll also keep the same log in there, ticking, right? If I do this again and we save, when I open show countdown, you can see it's still counting down, so that's all good. If I open up the console, well, it's still going a little nuts here, right? So it's still going a little nuts. Let's refresh just to make sure that it's not using old code here. I think it was. Let me try this again. If I click this now it's still going nuts. Why is it still going nuts? Because I didn't set 1 second here, right? That was a bit silly of me. Forgive me for that. So we'll come back to what we're looking at, because I'm thinking here it shouldn't have failed so badly. Now if I do it, it should start ticking after each second. Now I'm not sure why it's not saying ticking here. It should say ticking. Oh, there it is. I'm not sure why it wasn't coming up before, but it's coming up now. So now it seems to be working the way we want it to. But if I hide it, well, we get an error, okay? And the error is because we're trying to update the state of this component when the reality is we've just unmounted the component because we've hidden it, right? So basically, if we look at app.js, when I change or I click on this button, we're taking the ticker out of the DOM, right? So this is being unmounted at this point. The problem with that is this set interval is still running at this point. So it's still trying to update state on a component that's no longer exists, right? It's been unmounted. So the way to get around this is to use a return statement here and return a function that will be called when this component is unmounted. So think of this function as the will unmount function in the old class ones. What were they called again? I'm trying to remember. The component will unmount. I think that's the name of the lifecycle method. So in the old class days, that's what you would implement to do this. But with useEffect, all you need to do in the callback function is return that function. Now, with set interval, all we need to do is capture that interval. And then we just need to clear it. All right, so if I go clear interval, and then pass in that interval that we constructed up there, and save. If I refresh, and I click show countdown, well, we can see it's ticking down, right, which is good. And then down here, we can also see it's ticking away. But if I click hide countdown now you can see it's no longer ticking, right? And that's because this function got fired and the interval got cleared, right? Which is exactly what we want. If I click show countdown again, that useEffect is fired again, right? Which is good, right? It's fired this again because this component has been mounted again. Now, the last thing I'll talk about with useEffect before we move on is this array here. Okay, so what is this array? Well, essentially, this array is used for things that you use inside of this useEffect function that when their reference is changed, right, should refire this useEffect. Now, one of the dependencies for this useEffect really is this setNow function, right? So this really should be passed in because it's actually used inside this callback. In fact, usually React gives you a warning. Not sure why I'm not getting it here. Now, what will happen is if I was to change the reference of this function, then this useEffect would get refired. But that won't happen because useState always keeps one individual copy of this function while the component is mounted. So that's how this works, right? So there might be situations where you have other dependencies on this useEffect that you need to pass in and use in here, then you would pass it into this array. And only when those references change would this useEffect fire. Now for our timer, it's not a big deal. We just need to call setNow. That's it. All right, so that's all we need to do to get this working. But obviously, one step better than this would be to look at all this code and go, you know what? None of this really is needed to actually render the UI here, right? All we really need is the days, the hours, the minutes, the seconds, and if the timer's up. So a good practice for React is to create your own custom hook. So that's what we're going to do here. Okay, so I'm going to come over to my source. I'm going to create a folder called hooks. It's actually there from the last time I ran this. So if there's probably not a folder there before for you guys, but there's a hooks folder. In here, I'm going to create a useTicker.js file. And inside here, I'm just going to export a function. So export const useTicker equals arrow function. And this function is going to return basically an object that will have days, we'll say 0 for now, hours 0, minutes 0, and seconds 0. And then the last one will be, what is it? Is time up. like so, is time up. And for now, we'll just say false for that, okay? So let's just return this for the second. And inside of our ticker function, let's comment out a few things just to make sure our useTicker will work. So we'll get rid of that. And we'll get rid of this. And even this, we don't need that either. So now we can go const days, hours, minutes, seconds, and is time up is equal to that new hook that we just created. And we'll import that. And we'll leave all these things in for a second, but I'm going to move this above and put it there. And we get an error. What's the error now? Oh, now needs to be passed. And that's because I forgot to comment out this code. So this code also needs to be commented out. So now if I save, well, we're back to square one of having no time. So what we can do now is we can take all this logic that we have here. We can cut it out of here, like so. And we can implement it inside this useTicker function. So this will be our new hook that we're going to create. So the last thing is I'll grab these imports as well, and bring them in, like so. And now we'll uncomment the code that we have here. All right, so we'll uncomment this code. And we can see we've got an issue here with future date. That's because we want that to be an argument. So now we need to, and we've got an error there for the second, but that's because we need to pass it in there. And now we're all good again. And so now essentially, we just need to make sure that the return down here is days, hours, minutes, and seconds, and is time up. All right. In fact, might be able to do this all in one line, just like so, right? Just to make it a little bit nicer. Not so many lines of code, right? But that's up to you how you want to do that. So if I now do this, and I open up my countdown, well, now we can see it's working again, right? We can hide it, we can show it, it continues to work. It won't have the same issues that we had before because we're using useEffect, and everything still operates exactly the same. But now, if we look at it, our ticker now only has to worry about a few variables, right? Which is fantastic. It allows our components to remain dumb. It takes the complexity out of the component and puts it into our hook. Now, can we improve this code even more so? Well, we probably can, right? Let's think about what we've got here. So this code here, this interval to duration, this brings back a duration object that then we extract days, hours, minutes, and seconds from. So what we could do is say, okay, when the time is up, right, don't execute code any further. So we go if is time up. We're not going to execute any of this code. We're just going to return an object at that point, right? And all that will be is days will be 0, hours will be 0, minutes will be 0, seconds will be 0, and then lastly is time up will be, well, true. And we need to return that. That's why it's failing that. So we just return at that point. We don't go any further, right? So what that means is this code here, these days, hours, minutes, and seconds, well, this could be destructured from this object here. So we have no need for this stuff here, right? We can get rid of all those variables. And now we can say here, days, hours, minutes, and seconds. And then we can just remove that. All right, and then ultimately, we remove this if statement because we're using it up here already. We're defending against that. We can just destructure that. Or even better, if you wanted to, no, you can't quite do it here. So we destructure the values and then we pass a new object through. Cool. And if I save that now, and we'll give this a nice refresh and check, Now we can see everything is still working. Cool. So that is how we can create a countdown timer using React.js and hooks. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell. And I'll see you all next time.